Say it to my face! He laughed until he saw what she wrote on the napkin. She had endured the snapping fingers, the spilled drinks, and the 4 hours of condescending glares because she needed the paycheck. She tried to be the professional, she tried to stay silent, and she tried to be the nobody he assumed she was, because that was the kind of daughter she was. So when the billionaire leaned over the marble bar, insulted her in a language he thought she couldn't speak, and told his friends she was nothing but scenery, she didn't cry. She simply slid a napkin across the bar written in perfect Korean calligraphy, and what was written on that paper made the laughter in that elite lounge die instantly. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments, what time is it and where are you watching from? Let's start. For 6 months, Talia Grant had tried everything else. She had worked double shifts, ignored every slur, and swallowed her pride for the sake of a hospital bed in Nigeria. That is the part of the story that matters most, and the part Lee Do-hyun didn't know. He didn't know that the woman pouring his whiskey had spent her weekends in concrete basements becoming a legend. He thought he was mocking a bartender. He was actually challenging a lioness. The Seoul skyline glittered with the cold, diamond-like brilliance, but for Lee Do-hyun, the view from his private lounge was merely a backdrop to his own reflection. At 32, Do-hyun moved through the world as if it were a game he had already won. As the sole heir to a technology conglomerate, his days were a choreographed sequence of bowing executives in silk-lined boardrooms. He didn't just expect excellence, he demanded a world that reshaped itself to fit his whims. To him, people were categories, assets to be acquired or scenery to be ignored. He wore his arrogance like the Patek Philippe on his wrist, heavy, expensive, and designed to remind everyone exactly how much their time was worth compared to his. Across the polished marble of the bar, Talia Grant moved with a precision that was equally disciplined, though far less celebrated. While Do-hyun lived in the light of the crown, Talia existed in the tension of the shadows. Her life was a grueling split screen of survival. By day, she was the invisible bartender in a sleek black vest, navigating the fragile egos of men like Do-hyun with a silence they mistook for subservience. She poured $1,000 whiskeys with steady hands, her face a mask of professional neutrality, even as the guests barked orders as if she were a ghost. But when the lounge lights dimmed and the elite retreated to their penthouses, Talia's true shift began. Beneath the sleeves of her uniform, her arms were corded with the kind of muscle that wasn't built in a luxury health club. Every Saturday, she traded the scent of expensive gin for the metallic tang of sweat and damp concrete in the city's underground fighting circuit. In those lightless basements, she wasn't the help, she was a legend, a ghost who moved with the speed of a snapping wire. She didn't fight for glory or the roar of the crowd. She fought for the wire transfers she sent every Sunday morning to a clinic in Nigeria, where her mother's life was measured in the cost of dialysis and heart medication. Every punch she took was a debt paid, and every knockout she delivered was another week of breath for the woman who had raised her. Talia understood the world in a way Do-hyun never could. She knew that the most dangerous weapon wasn't a bank account or a family name. It was a body that had been forged in the fire of necessity. As Do-hyun leaned back in his leather chair, laughing at a joke at the expense of the slow service, he saw only a woman who was beneath his notice. He had no way of knowing that the hands currently polishing his crystal glass were the same hands that had never lost a fight, and that the crown he wore was about to be challenged by a woman who had been a warrior since the day she was born. The following morning, the luxury of the lounge felt like a fever dream as Talia stood in the sterile, fluorescent glare of a corner Western Union branch. The air here didn't smell of expensive gin. It smelled of wet pavement and the quiet desperation of people sending their lives across oceans. Talia looked down at the crumpled stack of bills in her hand, the tips she had earned while being mocked by Do-hyun, and the blood money from a 3-round knockout in a basement the night before. Her fingers traced the bruised knuckles beneath her sleeve as she waited for the transaction to clear. This was the Sunday transfer, the silent ritual that kept the world spinning on its axis. On the other side of the planet, in a crowded clinic in Lagos, that money meant another week of dialysis. It meant the difference between her mother breathing easily or gasping for air in a hallway because a bed wasn't paid for. While she waited, her phone buzzed with a video call. She hesitated, adjusting her collar to hide the faint yellowing bruise on her neck before answering. Her mother's face appeared on the cracked screen, looking smaller and more fragile than she had just 7 days ago. The vibrant woman who had once worked 3 jobs to bring Talia to America was now a collection of sharp angles and tired smiles. "You look tired, my Talia," her mother whispered, her voice a thin thread of silk. "Are you eating? Are you resting?" "I'm fine, Ma," Talia lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her muscles ached with a deep, bone-weary fatigue that sleep couldn't touch. The job at the lounge is easy, just pouring drinks for people with too much money. It's quiet work. She didn't mention the underground ring. She didn't mention the roar of the gamblers or the metallic taste of a split lip. She certainly didn't mention the arrogant billionaire who treated her like part of the furniture. To her mother, Talia was the success story, the daughter who had made it to the land of opportunity and found a peaceful life. The clerk slid a receipt across the counter, and Talia felt a momentary surge of relief as she watched the numbers vanish into the digital ether. But the relief was fleeting. Every transfer was just a temporary stay of execution. The medical bills were a mountain that grew faster than she could climb, and the pressure was a physical weight on her chest, heavier than any opponent she had ever faced in the ring. As she hung up the phone, Talia caught her reflection in the glass of the teller window. The invisible bartender was gone, and for a split second, the underground legend peered back, dark, determined, and dangerous. She wasn't just working for a paycheck, she was fighting for a life. And if Lee Do-hyun chose to cross her path again, he would find out that a woman with a mother to save has no room left for patience. The air in the lounge was thick with the scent of ambergris and the low hum of deals being struck in whispers. But at the center bar, Lee Do-hyun's voice was the only one that mattered. He had been there for 3 hours, his tie loosened just enough to signal a dangerous kind of relaxation. Every time Talia moved to serve another guest, he found a way to disrupt her rhythm, demanding a different garnish, complaining about the temperature of the glass, or accidentally sliding a crystal tumbler off the coaster so she had to catch it. He was playing with her, testing the limits of the woman he viewed as a silent, black-clad statue. The breaking point came when Talia reached for a bottle of high-end scotch on the top shelf. Do-hyun reached out, his hand closing over her wrist with a grip that was meant to humiliate rather than hurt. Talia didn't pull away, she simply stopped, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. The room went quiet as the guests sensed the shift in pressure. "You're very efficient, Talia," Do-hyun said, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. "But you lack soul. You move like a machine that's been told it's human." He let go of her wrists and turned to his friends, switching seamlessly into rapid-fire Korean. "She's like a stray dog in a silk collar," he sneered, his friends erupting into sharp, jagged laughter. "You can put her in a nice bar, but you can't wash the dirt of the streets off her. She probably doesn't even know which end of the bottle is which." He turned back to her, a smirk playing on his lips, expecting the same blank, uncomprehending stare he'd received all night. But Talia wasn't looking at the shelf anymore. She was looking directly into his eyes, a cold, focused light behind her pupils that made his smirk falter for a fraction of a second. Without a word, she reached under the counter and pulled out a linen napkin and a silver pen. She wrote quickly, her hand steady and precise. When she was finished, she slid the napkin across the marble toward him. Do-hyun picked it up, expecting a phone number or a plea for a tip. Instead, his face went ashen as he read the elegant, perfect Korean calligraphy. "If you feel so powerful behind a desk, come see if you can stand in the ring. Saturday, midnight, unless you're only brave in a language you think I don't speak." The silence that followed was absolute. Do-hyun looked from the napkin to the woman he'd dismissed as scenery, realizing for the first time he hadn't been mocking a bartender, he had been poking a sleeping lioness. His pride, stung by the very language he used as a shield, left him no choice. He slammed his hand on the bar, his eyes narrowing. "Saturday," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and a new, dark curiosity. Talia didn't blink. She simply picked up a cloth and began to polish the spot where his hand had been, erasing his presence as if he were nothing more than a smudge of dirt. Do-hyun spent the remainder of the week in a state of amused irritation. To him, the napkin was a theatrical bluff, a desperate attempt by a servant to reclaim a shred of dignity. He viewed the upcoming Saturday not as a genuine athletic contest, but as a disciplinary session. He spent his afternoons at his private athletic club practicing sharp academic combinations against a heavy bag while his trainers offered honeyed praise. He imagined the fight would be a brief, controlled affair, a few sharp jabs to show her the difference between a world-class coaching and her own deluded bravado. He even considered bringing a photographer, thinking the image of him humbled by a woman might play well as a quirky PR stunt for his tech conglomerate's diversity initiative. He was a man who played at war, never realizing that the stakes were real. While Do-hyun rehearsed his victory in a climate-controlled gym, Talia returned to the basement. The transition happened the moment she stepped through the rusted iron door of an abandoned textile factory in the city's industrial fringe. The air here was thick with the smell of old grease and liniment, vibrating with the low rhythmic bass of a crowd that didn't exist in the light. This was the Iron Pit, and as Talia walked toward the locker rooms, the regulars stepped aside. The invisible bartender was gone, and for a split second, the underground legend peered back, dark, determined, and dangerous. She wasn't just working for a paycheck, she was fighting for a life. And if Lee Do-hyun chose to cross her path again, he would find out that a woman with a mother to save has no room left for patience. The transition from the velvet-lined lounge to the Iron Pit was a sensory assault that Lee Do-hyun had not prepared for. He arrived in a sleek black SUV, flanked by 4 of his top security enforcers, and a handful of friends who expected a glamorous, high-stakes spectacle. Instead, they were greeted by the oppressive humidity of a subterranean basement that hummed with the raw energy of 1,000 desperate hearts. The air was a thick soup of unwashed sweat, cheap cigarettes, and the metallic tang of blood. There were no chandeliers here, only bare, buzzing fluorescent bulbs that cast long, sickly shadows across the crumbling concrete walls. As Do-hyun stepped into the room, his handmade Italian loafers crunching over grit and glass, the crowd went silent. It was a predatory silence. The gamblers, the dock workers, and the street-hardened locals didn't see a billionaire or a success story. They saw a man who looked like he had never bled a day in his life. Do-hyun's friends huddled together, their expensive silk shirts dampened by the heat, looking around the room with the wide-eyed terror of tourists who had accidentally wandered into a lion's den. This wasn't a PR stunt. There were no cameras, no safety ropes, and no cooling fans. There was only a makeshift ring of heavy hemp rope and a floor stained with the history of 1,000 lost teeth. At the center of the ring stood Talia. The shift was absolute. She wasn't the woman who had politely served them scotch. She was a statue of obsidian and intent. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, utilitarian braid, and her hands were encased in black wraps that looked as hard as stone. The faint bruise on her cheek from a previous fight acted as a badge of office, a stark contrast to Do-hyun's pristine, unblemished skin. She didn't look at his entourage, and she didn't acknowledge the wealth he projected. She simply waited, her breathing rhythmic and deep, her focus narrowed until the entire world consisted only of the 6 feet of space between her and the man who had dared to call her nothing. Do-hyun felt a sudden, sharp chill in the sweltering heat. He realized with a sinking sensation in his stomach that the legend he had heard whispers of wasn't a myth. The people in the room weren't cheering for him or his status. They were shouting a name he hadn't known she owned. Ghost! 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 The chant shook the pipes in the ceiling. As he climbed through the ropes, the realization finally hit him. He wasn't here to discipline a servant. He was in the home of a predator, and for the first time in his life, his money couldn't buy him a way out of the fight. The bell didn't ring with the silver chime of a luxury hotel. It was a harsh, metallic clang that signaled the end of the world Do-hyun knew. He moved first, driven by a desperate need to re-establish the hierarchy. He threw a sharp, textbook jab, the kind his expensive trainers had called flawless. Talia didn't even blink. She slipped the punch with a movement so minute it looked like a glitch in reality, her head moving just an inch to the left as the wind of his glove brushed her ear. Before he could pull his hand back, she was inside his guard. She didn't hit him with a knockout blow, not yet. She hit him with the reality of his own inadequacy. A short, stinging hook to the ribs made Do-hyun's breath hitch, a sound of genuine shock that was drowned out by the roar of the basement. He scrambled back, his footwork becoming sloppy on the uneven concrete. He realized then that Talia wasn't just faster, she was more permanent. She moved with a terrifying economy, her feet rooted to the ground, while his felt like they were treading on ice. The second minute was a masterclass in dismantling a man's ego. Every time Do-hyun tried to reset, Talia was there, a shadow that he couldn't outrun. She picked him apart with surgical precision, a jab to the nose that brought the copper taste of blood to his mouth, a body shot that felt like being hit by a freight train. His elite technique, practiced in front of mirrors and yes-men, crumbled. He realized his power had always been an illusion maintained by people who were paid to lose to him. Here, in the iron pit, his bank account was zero. By the final minute, Do-hyun's vision was blurring. He looked toward his friends, the sharks of the corporate world, and saw only horror on their faces. They weren't coming to save him. Talia finally stepped forward, her eyes locked onto his with a chilling, quiet intensity. She didn't look angry. She looked like she was finishing a long day's work. She feinted a right, drawing his guard up, and then delivered a devastating left hook that connected flush with his jaw. The sound of the impact echoed off the concrete walls. Do-hyun's knees buckled, his world spinning into a kaleidoscope of gray and black. He hit the floor hard, the cold concrete of final, uncompromising truth. He tried to push himself up, his fingers scraping the grit, but his body refused to obey. As his security team scrambled through the ropes to scoop up his limp, broken form, he caught one last glimpse of Talia. She wasn't celebrating. She was already beginning to unwrap her hands, her face as calm and stoic as the day she had first poured his drink. The billionaire was carried out like a sack of discarded silk, leaving the ghost alone in the center of the ring, her legend etched in the blood he had left on the floor. The world returned to Lee Do-hyun in fractured pieces, the rhythmic beep of a private monitor, the scent of expensive antiseptic, and a dull, throbbing ache in his jaw that felt like a permanent guest. He lay in his penthouse suite, the floor-to-ceiling windows showing a city that looked smaller, less significant than it had 48 hours ago. His reflection in the darkened glass showed a man with a bruised face and a split lip, a sight that should have ignited a wildfire of legal retaliation. Yet, as he stared at his own shattered image, the rage he expected to feel never came. Instead, there was a quiet, piercing clarity. For the first time in 32 years, something had reached him that his money couldn't buffer. Talia's left hook hadn't just broken his guard, it had cracked the porcelain shell of his entitlement. He remembered the look in her eyes before the final blow. Not hatred, but a profound, exhausting indifference. To her, he wasn't a titan of industry or a prince of soul. He was just a man who didn't know how to stand his ground. As soon as he could speak without wincing, Do-hyun dismissed his lawyers and his PR team. He didn't want a lawsuit. He wanted the truth. He summoned his head of private security, a man used to digging up dirt for hostile takeovers, but this time the request was different. "Don't look for scandals," Do-hyun rasped, his voice thick. "Look for the why. Find out why a woman who can move like that is pouring my drinks for minimum wage. The report arrived by sunset. As Do-han flipped through the pages, the scenery of his life began to take on a vivid, haunting color. He saw the wire transfer receipts to Lagos, the soaring costs of Nigerian cardiac care, and the records of a father who had died in a mangled car wreck when Talia was barely a child. He looked at the surveillance photos of her entering the iron pit, not for glory, but for survival. He realized that while he had been playing at life, she had been fighting for it. The realization was a second, deeper blow. Every insult he had hurled at her in Korean, every glass he had dropped for her to clean, played back in his mind like a shameful reel of a stranger's life. He saw himself through her eyes, a small man hiding behind a big bank account. The obsession took root then, but it wasn't the predatory hunger of the past. It was a desperate, burning need to understand the source of her strength. He had been surrounded by people who bowed to his shadow, but he had finally met the woman who lived in the light of her own fire. Do-han closed the folder, his fingers tracing the bruise on his jaw. He didn't want his pride back. He wanted to know the woman who had been brave enough to take it from him. The following Tuesday, Do-han didn't return to the lounge as a customer. He waited by the service entrance as the humid evening air began to cool, his bruise now a faded yellow map of his own arrogance. When Talia emerged, her gym bag slung over one shoulder and her eyes already scanning the street for the bus, she stopped dead. Her hand instinctively tightened on the strap of her bag, her weight shifting into a stance that promised a very different kind of conversation. "I'm not here to fight, Talia," Do-han said quickly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace that felt foreign to his bones. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin, white envelope. "I know about Lagos. I know about the clinic and the dialysis. I've already contacted the directors there. Your mother's bills, the surgery, the aftercare, it's all been settled, for good." Talia didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, her face hardened into a mask of cold, sharp granite. The silence that stretched between them was more uncomfortable than the 3 minutes they had spent in the ring. She stepped toward him, but there was no warmth in the proximity. "You think this is a game of debt, don't you? You think because you have a checkbook, you can erase the night you spent mocking me. You think you can buy your way out of being a coward." "It's not charity," Do-han argued, his old instincts flaring. "It's a solution. Why would you keep breaking your body in a basement when I can fix this with a signature?" "Because it's my body," Talia snapped, her eyes flashing, "and it's my mother. I didn't fight for your pity, Do-han. I fought for her life. If you pay those bills, you aren't saving her. You're taking the only thing I have left, which is the right to say I earned her breath." She stepped closer, her finger jabbing into the expensive wool of his lapel. "You want to be a savior because you don't know how to be a man. A savior looks down, a partner looks across. Until you can see me without looking for a way to fix me, stay away from my mother's name." She pushed past him, leaving him standing alone by the trash bins and the flickering neon. Do-han looked down at the envelope in his hand, the paper feeling suddenly heavy and meaningless. He realized then that he had tried to solve a human soul with a transaction. He had treated her heart like a hostile takeover, and for the second time in a week, she had left him staring at the ground. He watched her walk toward the bus stop, her spine straight and her spirit unbroken, and finally understood the lesson. He didn't need to save her. He needed to be worthy of standing beside her. He tucked the envelope back in his pocket and started to walk, not toward his car, but in her direction, finally ready to learn how to follow. The transformation did not happen overnight. It was built in the quiet hours after the lounge closed, in the sweat-soaked air of the iron pit, and in the long, difficult conversations where Do-han finally learned to listen. He didn't come back with envelopes of cash. He came back with a pair of wraps and a willingness to learn. He traded his boardroom power for the humility of the mat, letting Talia teach him the discipline of a life where nothing is given and everything is earned. In the process of losing his ego, he finally found his soul. He stopped being the man who wanted to own the world and became the man who wanted to be worthy of the woman who had conquered it. Their wedding was not the media circus Soul expected. There were no cameras from the business dailies and no strategic guest lists. It was held in a sunlight-drenched garden in Lagos, with the Atlantic breeze carrying the scent of salt and hibiscus. Talia's mother was there, her eyes bright and her breath steady, watching from a chair that was no longer a symbol of her illness, but a throne of her recovery. The treatment had been successful, funded not as an act of cold charity, but as a family's collective effort. For the first time, Talia's hands, the hands that had fought for every cent, were at rest, folded into the steady, supportive grip of a husband who saw her as his equal, his teacher, and his strength. Back in Seoul, they built a legacy that the Jung Syndicate would never understand. They opened a chain of community centers that were half gym, half academy, designed for the invisible people of the city. Dohan managed the infrastructure with a new, compassionate efficiency, while Talia headed the training programs, turning the Iron Pit's grit into a curriculum for resilience. They didn't just provide funding, they provided a pathway for at-risk youth to find the same discipline that had saved Talia's family. The billionaire and the boxer became a new kind of empire, one where wealth was a tool and grit was the currency. On the anniversary of their first fight, Do-hyun and Talia returned to the basement where it all began. They didn't fight. They simply stood in the center of the ring, looking at the concrete floor that had once been a site of humiliation and was now a foundation of respect. The billionaire who had once mocked a bartender for her lack of soul now stood beside a legend, realizing that the greatest victory of his life wasn't the billions in his bank account, but the privilege of standing in the light of the woman who had taught him how to truly live. Thank you for watching. This is Afro-Korean Truling. Subscribe for more true stories without filters. Arrogance is a language that everyone understands, but respect is a language you have to earn. Lee Do-hyun thought his wealth made him a giant, while he viewed Talia's service as a sign of smallness. He failed to realize that a person's day job is often just the armor they wear to protect a warrior's spirit. Never judge someone by the apron they wear or the task they perform. The person you are looking down on today might be the only one strong enough to pick you up or put you in your place tomorrow. True power isn't found in how much you can buy, but in how much you can endure. Don't mock the invisible people in your life. You never know what kind of legend is standing right in front of you. Thanks for watching. You will find the video at the upper right of the screen entertaining. Check it out.